Welcome to the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists. I'm Mike Friedman, the 113th president of the National Press Club. I'm the former general manager of CBS Radio Network, now journalist in residence at University of Maryland Global Campus, and executive producer of the Kalb Report public broadcasting series moderated by journalist Marvin Kalb. We thank you for joining us today for our virtual headliner book event with Jacob Soboroff, author of Separated: Inside an American Tragedy. In June of 2018, the NBC News and MSNBC correspondent traded his microphone and camera for a small blue notebook and walked into a large detention facility where some 1,500 migrant boys were being held after being separated from their parents at the U.S. Mexico border. The notes he took that day, the indelible impressions left on him, and the conversations he would later have with affected families and inside sources formed the basis of what became a harrowing New York Times best-selling book. Jacob is with us virtually today from California to share insights from his experiences with the children and families that he has followed since the crisis unfolded, what he believes the lasting impact will be of the Trump administration's zero-tolerance immigration policy, and where we go from here. Jacob, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We will accept questions from our online audience today. I'll ask as many as time permits. To submit a question, please email headliners@press.org. Jacob, there are two quotes at the top of the National Press Club homepage. The first is from the late Congressman John Lewis, who said, "Without the press, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings." The second, from our own leadership here at the club, is, "Reporters are witnesses. To silence the press is to silence the people, silence accountability, and silence truth." You refer to yourself in the book as an unlikely witness. Talk about that with us and the relevance of those quotes to your work.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and I appreciate the question. I think that the truth of the matter is, I think I have become identified in some measure amongst our audience at MSNBC as the reporter who was right in the middle of the family separation tragedy. And yes, I was there. I went into that former Walmart, 250,000 square feet, where kids were allowed outside only 2 hours a day, inside 22 hours a day. And I went into that facility where the kids were in cages under those Mylar blankets, and I saw them supervised by security contractors in a watchtower, and all of that for no other reason than the Trump administration systematically rip them away from their parents in what we now know, according to Physicians for Human Rights, meets the UN definition of torture. But I did not intend to be there. And despite the fact that I was covering border issues, that I thought it was important under Trump to understand the reality of life along the southwest border, that I wanted to know about drugs coming in and whether or not people, if they were coming in through legal ports of entry or people were sneaking in as MS-13 gang members, I was focused on the wrong thing. And so when family separation happened, I didn't know. I wasn't fully equipped. I did not understand that this was a 30-year lead up to this point under Democratic and Republican administrations that allowed this moment, what one official described to me in the book as the greatest humanitarian catastrophe of my lifetime, to happen. And so when I say I was an unlikely eyewitness, there were many people that were better prepared, that understood better, and frankly, journalists that have been covering this more closely than I had. But there I was. And so in the book, I wanted to look back and understand how we got to this point and how someone like me, frankly, missed the lead up to it.
So describe for us your feelings in your first moments inside Casa Padre. As you mentioned, the former Walmart converted into a holding facility for the migrant children.
To this day, it's hard to wrap my head around what I saw. You know, when you walk into a place that was a Walmart, and in the loading dock you have, hundreds of the 1,500 migrant boys ages 10 to 17 that were housed there watching the Disney film Moana, or you see them doing Tai Chi, or you watch them playing video games, or they're in line at the chow as if they're in a jail or a prison. I mean, that was the only way that I knew how to describe it at the time, because I had covered stories inside jails and inside a state prison. And so when I came out and I talked to Chris Hayes, my colleague that night on the air, what I said was the only thing I knew how to say. This place is nominally a shelter, but effectively these children are incarcerated. And of those 1,500 boys that were there in this facility that was literally overflowing because of the family separation policy, hundreds of them, maybe 400 of them, were only there and would have never been there otherwise had they not been rendered unaccompanied, taken from their parents by the Trump administration in order to deter other families from coming. And the thing that will stick with me the most is what one official said to me. She said, and there were no cages in this facility. There were cages in the other facility I saw. She said, make sure you smile at them because they feel like animals in cages being looked at. And I'll never forget that for as long as I live, Mike.
You mentioned there was a 30-year run-up, basically, to what happened. In the course of your subsequent research and reporting, what were you able to uncover about the planning for the Trump administration's immigration policies? And was there a specific architect that you determined for this plan?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the architect of family separations, or the group of people who can be considered architects, actually go back to the Obama administration. And there's a lot of conversation about Obama did this too. And let me just say outright, no, Obama never systematically separated thousands of migrant children. The idea was rejected out of hand by people like Jay Johnson and Cecilia Munoz when it was raised by operators inside the Department of Homeland Security as a response to a surge in unaccompanied migrant children from Central America. But that doesn't mean that the Obama administration was anything but beloved by the immigrant activists and immigrants' rights communities. They built the facility where Trump held children in cages. The Obama administration deported more people than any other presidency in the history of the United States of America. But they didn't go forward with this idea raised by people with inside ICE, inside Customs and Border Protection, that a deterrence-based way of stopping people from coming to the country would be to systematically take away parents and their children. And I report in the book about a meeting that was, until this point, relatively secret. It had been mentioned in some congressional testimony, but Valentine's Day 2017, weeks after the president was inaugurated, a bunch of officials, both holdovers from Obama and new Trump appointees, gathered in the conference room of Kevin McAleenan, then at the time the acting head of Customs and Border Protection. This idea was floated. Some officials left shell-shocked, others left emboldened. And moving forward from there, it was a secret attempt to develop this policy. John Kelly confirmed as much, as a matter of fact, in March of 2017 on CNN. And they went forward with a series of events, including a pilot program in El Paso that ultimately led to the massive and wide-scale separations that we all saw in the spring and summer of 2018.
So as you point out, it's clear that members of the administration knew that these policies also constituted human rights abuses. Some even attempted to speak out about it. How do you think those voices were silenced this time around? And was that the line of demarcation that differentiates the Obama administration from the Trump administration?
Well, there were people, the same people speaking out during the Obama administration. One of them is Jim De La Cruz, who is essentially a federal field specialist in the Department of Health and Human Services. He said at the time, and started keeping an informal list to keep track of separated parents, because there were, on a small basis, separations that occurred at the border. And by the way, immigration activists would argue there were plenty of separations in the interior because of those deportations, but that's a different type of separation. I'm not taking away from it. I'm not saying they weren't as painful as border separations. But during the Obama administration, people like Jim De La Cruz pushed back and said, in his memo, his email is in my book, the only way to stop the problems associated with reunifications of parents and children is to not separate in the first place. And so as we moved into the Trump administration, the one example that sticks out to me much more than any other is chapter 5 of my book, where Scott Lloyd, the head of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the man who was the custodian, legal governmental custodian of the 10,000 plus children in the custody of the U.S. government, despite warnings by his direct reports, including Jonathan White, a career public service health professional, that separations would damage children psychologically, but also they would literally not have the capacity to hold them. His first instinct when the list of separated children in April 2018 leaked to Caitlin Dickerson of the New York Times was to get rid of the list. And so what you see, and that's just one example, and his subordinates believed he instructed them to destroy the list, and they did not do so, I should say, is example after example of things like that. ICE, career officials in ICE saying, if we separate, we're not going to have the technology to put the families back together because the back-end systems do not speak to each other. Yet, people like Kevin McAleenan and Kirstjen Nielsen move forward with this policy anyway, and indeed, Kirstjen Nielsen signed the memo that effectuated the wide-scale separations, despite people under her saying very clearly that this was going to be a logistical nightmare that would have lasting psychological impacts on these children.
And I'll just jump to, as a follow-up, that question. Talk about the logistical nightmare and the psychological impact on these children.
Well, a century of suffering. Childhood trauma leads to a century of suffering, and that's not my analysis. That is the analysis of healthcare professionals, and specifically of one official directly involved in the reunifications of these children. And that is what he told me. That official is basically saying what will happen to these children, what happened to these children, I should say, will be with them for the rest of their lives. And I'll give you an anecdotal example. Juan and Jose, the father and son I write about in my book, when I went down to the border to cover President Trump when he was in Yuma maybe a month and a half ago, texted me. We were texting, and I said, I'm going back to Yuma, where you guys were apprehended and separated and kept apart for almost 5 months. And he said to me, if you see President Trump, ask him a question for me. Why did he separate us, and why did he traumatize us psychologically? That's exactly what this was. It's exactly why Physicians for Human Rights calls this torture. It's why the American Academy of Pediatrics called it government-sanctioned child abuse. And there are literally 5,400 stories, more than 5,400 stories, each its own version of what happened, and all of them having this same underlying common denominator, that the administration, in a systematic way, in this campaign-style way, inflicted this pain on them for no other reason than to keep people from coming here.
Hundreds of rank-and-file Customs and Border Patrol employees participated in enacting the policies following the directives. That seems to have echoes of just following orders as an argument. What does this say to you about the moral compass of our government bureaucracy and perhaps for our country as a whole?
Well, I'll give you a very specific example. It says that there's a massive lack of a moral compass amongst those, not necessarily who implemented this. Indeed, there are many agents on the line in the Border Patrol, and we saw those Facebook messages. I mean, it's undeniable, the racism and xenophobia amongst the ranks of Border Patrol agents. I've met, though, many kind, caring Border Patrol agents who I believe are doing their best and signing up to become law enforcement officers, not daycare babysitters child separators. And the mission of this agency, created under the Bush administration, Department of Homeland Security, in the wake of 9/11, has been perverted. It's undeniable under the Trump administration to this level of cruelty, as Adam Serwer put it when he wrote that the cruelty is the point, to inflict harm upon people for the purpose of deterrence. And while Trump supersized this, I cannot stress enough how important it is to understand, and what I've learned since seeing this with my own eyes, that starting in the Clinton administration, the official policy of the Border Patrol was prevention through deterrence, to build walls so people would go on dangerous and deadly journeys through what the Border Patrol itself called hostile terrain, knowing that they would be forced to make a decision between potential death and migration to the United States. And deterrence never works. That's what I've learned. I mean, you hear agents, you hear it from immigration lawyers who represent people who come to this country. The idea that you can scare someone away, whether it's through family separation or indefinite detention, or turning children around at the border immediately, which the administration is now doing, it will never stop people from coming here. It will only make them face harsher decisions and calculations about coming here and how they are going to do it. Because when you go to Guatemala or other places in Central America in the so-called Northern Triangle, like I have, and ask people if they want to come, the answer is always no. Nobody wants to leave their home. But were it not for desperate situations, which include poverty, malnutrition, gang violence, persecution, people wouldn't leave. They don't want to leave. Nobody wants to leave their home.
Through your research and your reporting on this, and you say deterrence never worked, did you get a sense of what might work?
Well, we know it works. The president, in the face of evidence that climate change and climate variability was pushing migrants to leave places like Chiquimula and Zacapa in Guatemala, where I went and visited myself to see how the devastation of the coffee industry is creating this poverty and malnutrition that is forcing people to flee. The president defunded that type of international foreign aid that helped mitigate those exact crises. The president, on multiple occasions, did things that created a man-made crisis at the border, whether it was backing people up or taking away aid that would mitigate the causes of migration. We know why people are leaving, and we know what will help people stay. And the idea that taking away that aid is going to in some way help or punish or deter further, it was the exact opposite of the truth. And that's something that I got to see with my own eyes as the Trump administration was doing it.
Did you find any similar instances of this in American history?
Sure. There's no way to not look at this through the lens of the other horrors of American history. And I write that this is one of the most shameful chapters of modern American history, but I don't see how what the American government did to these children will not be remembered with the original sin of slavery or Native American genocide or Japanese internment. This was deliberate cruelty that was pushed forward by members of this administration whose racist and xenophobic ideas are well known, particularly Stephen Miller. My colleague Julia Ainsley and I reported just last week during the Democratic convention that Stephen Miller said it would be un-American to not move forward with separating children. And that was in the face of warnings from Kirstjen Nielsen, who, I don't think this is particularly exculpatory because she signed the policy into place regardless, but Kirstjen Nielsen warned cabinet members in the Situation Room of the White House that this policy was going to be a logistical disaster, that children would be backed up, that there would be problems. And Stephen Miller's response was, not only would it be un-American not to do it, but he asked for a show of hands vote in the White House Situation Room, where invited guests included John Bolton, who I know you've spoken with recently, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Mark Short, who's now the Vice President's Chief of Staff, Don McGahn, who was the White House counsel, John Kelly was invited, and the list goes on and on. And so how do you decouple that underlying ideology ultimately from what happened? I don't think that you can.
I have some questions for you from someone I consider one of the finest writers in journalism today, and you may have read some of her pieces over the course of time. Laura King of the Los Angeles Times, who was a longtime foreign correspondent and served as the Kabul, Afghanistan bureau chief for the LA Times, and then was in Cairo and other locations around the world. Talk about the importance of sensory impressions in guiding your work, sights, sounds, smells, and how did these very visceral memories inform even the more analytical aspects of your story?
When I started to write this book, I went and pulled out my little blue notebook that you mentioned earlier that I grabbed on my way to that former Walmart in Brownsville, Texas, and I scribbled everything down. And I had put it away for probably a year. And when I decided to write the book, I went and I dug it out from my storage unit, my public storage unit, where I have a baby changing table, which I've now pulled out again because we have a new little baby, but a pendant lamp, Christmas decorations. Yes, this Jewish boy has Christmas decorations, thanks to my wife. And there was the notebook. And when I picked up the notebook and I opened it for the first time, first of all, it burned in my hand, and it immediately brought back to me the sights and the sounds and the smells of being inside those two facilities, the Border Patrol processing station in McAllen, Texas, where the cages were, and the Walmart. And that's what I tried to communicate. I mean, I've never done, I don't think I've still done to this day, a 7-minute live report, unscripted, unplanned, straight through, like I did with Chris Hayes that night. And all Chris wanted to know was, what did I see with my own eyes? What were the facts on the ground, to use a military and diplomatic term? Because we had all been talking about this so much. Chris had been talking about it on his program. In the abstract, people had been writing about it. Journalists like Lomi Creel and Caitlin Dickerson, who I mentioned, and Julia Ainsley, my good friend and now colleague, had been reporting on this. But until that moment, no one had seen for ourselves, with our own eyes, what the conditions of the migrant children who were detained in these facilities looked like. So all I tried to do was go back to my training as an advanced man. I was an advanced person in college for Mike Bloomberg in New York, and then Howard Dean when he ran for president. And what I was told was, if you don't know what you're talking about, say I don't know. And if the principal asks you a question, look straight at him or her and tell them exactly what you saw, and that's it, period. Don't editorialize. And that's what I did. I walked out and I looked into that camera, and Chris Hayes for that day was like the mayor of New York or the presidential candidate or whatever the case may be. And I told him exactly what I saw, if he were to walk in there, exactly what he would experience. And what I didn't do was modulate the way that it made me feel as a human being, because I didn't think it was possible. And not that I didn't think it was possible, it just wasn't possible. I didn't know how not to be emotionally affected. And to the credit of my bosses at NBC, nobody ever called me and said, chill, it's too much. This affected you and you need to take a step away. They said, as a reporter, but also as a parent and a human being, you tell us what you saw inside there, because that's what the American people are asking and wondering. And that's the way that I approach the story from that moment forward.
I'm going to jump to a craft question because you've touched on something so important. And this is also about being a witness. A defining moment in the history of broadcast journalism took place in April of 1945, 75 years ago, when Edward R. Murrow was among the first journalists allowed inside the Buchenwald concentration camp upon its liberation by the Allied forces. After walking through the camp, observing and talking to survivors, he went back to his hotel room and he processed what he saw for 3 days before composing himself and reporting on it for CBS Radio. At one point in his report, he said, and I'm quoting now, "As we walked out into the courtyard, a man fell dead. 2 others, they must have been over 60, were crawling toward the latrine. I saw it, but will not describe it." For the radio audience in 1945, Murrow at once painted a picture for the mind's eye that was perhaps more devastating than any number of words could convey. And by not describing it, in that particular case, he gave the victims a modicum of dignity. Talk about, if you would, descriptive writing and how that differs from the use of sound and video. Certainly nobody's going to be allowed today, for instance, to go back and sit in their hotel room for 3 days and process what they saw. You live the life of a broadcast and cable journalist today, but talk about the descriptive writing and how it differs from the use of sound and video.
Well, and I didn't have. You're right. I didn't have that opportunity. I walked out of Casa Padre, and waiting for me was a camera set up, and I walked right up to it. And within, I think, an hour of walking out of there, I was on TV with Chris. And it was a different experience for me because I am a broadcast journalist, and I'm not a writer. I wasn't a writer before I, embarked on this book. And so what I needed to do was sort of what I just described to you. Go back to my roots as an advanced person and vacuum up every little detail that I could, and then decide almost in real time what were the critical details I needed to share with our audience, our nationwide audience, who had been asking for these same details for weeks, if not months, with the policy and development, and describe what I felt best captured what I saw with my own eyes. And so the way that I did it was I wrote it all down in the notebook. And I went back and I sat in the car in between the hour during that hour I walked out, and before I talked to Chris, I sat in the passenger seat of the rented minivan that we had picked up at the airport earlier that day. I went through my notes line by line, and I underlined the things that I thought to me were noteworthy or newsworthy. And that's what I did. I sort of ticked through that list with Chris. But where this differed from a Murrow report in many ways, I've known Murrow, but where this differed from a report, like it wasn't a report for nightly, it wasn't a report for nightly news. What it was a live question and answer session with one of our primetime anchors on the network. And so one thing that I would say would beget a question from Chris about another. And so I just knew I needed to be prepared to answer what Chris wanted to know at that moment. And so that's what I did. I went back and I read through my notes to be as prepared as I could to recount what I saw inside. There was no video, there were no photos. And only later were we given government handout photos, which, effectively were propaganda. This is the way that the government wanted you to see what was going on inside. And they didn't trust us to show our version of what was happening.
Murrow's final line, by the way, in that report was, and I'm quoting again, "If I have offended you by this rather mild account of Buchenwald, I'm not the least sorry."
Yeah.
That's pretty powerful, and it sounds like as you were answering those questions live an hour after coming out, your job was to relate what you saw, not to couch it in terms that would not offend anybody.
No, but what I will say, Mike, is that when a few days later on Father's Day 2018, I went into the McAllen Ursula processing station where the cages were, I had to make a decision in real time as to whether I was going to describe those cages, as what they were. And I really didn't know any other way to describe them. And I came out and I did think after that tour, do I call them, like the first thing I thought of, they kind of look like baseball backstops. They also look like dog kennels. I just didn't know what to say. And to the idea of being objective for the sake of objectivity, I didn't find it subjective to call them cages. That's what they were. I mean, they were cages, and anybody who could go in and see that for themselves would call it the same thing. And they were the same thing, by the way, in the Obama administration when they were there under Obama. And it's important to say that as well. It's again where I give credit to my own bosses, that when I came out and I talked as a reporter, but also as a human who just had interpreted something that I think would shock anybody who saw it, they didn't call me and say stop. They said keep going forward. And the way that I sort of now interpret all that is that I don't even think it's healthy as a human being, much less a reporter, to try to make something sound neutral when there is no neutral description. This was what it was. And had I tried to couch it in some more palatable term for somebody who might be offended, that mysterious person, I would have been doing a disservice to everybody.
You have two children.
I do.
How did parenthood affect you as you wrote this book?
Well, it's undeniable that as a father, at the time I was a father of one young boy who was 2 years old. That day, that Father's Day, My wife sent me a video of him watching me on which probably was not a great idea in retrospect, but nobody knew what was going on. Of him and her watching me on television that morning, that Sunday morning, inside this facility where the government was systematically ripping away children from its parents. And uh, I just can't. It was not possible to decouple my family life, my life as a new father, a young father, from the life of all these people who were my contemporaries, having this happen to them. Um, and again, that just goes back to that is the reality of who I am and what happened when I was put into this situation. And while maybe I wasn't the perfect person to tell the story, I mean, I certainly didn't have the lived experience of the people who come to this country. Um, I'm a white, privileged person, very obviously. But I think that the best I could do, given that in the circumstances, be as honest as I could about who I was, who I am, and what I was seeing. And part of my identity was a father of a young child.
You've mentioned a couple times already about the support you received from your organization, from NBC and MSNBC. There's seems to me, a message here for journalism leaders who are viewing this and who will see this on video afterward. Right now, we're obviously experiencing a major continuing story about racial equality and social justice. And investigative reporting, reporting on social justice issues, these take time. They're not spot news stories that you can parachute in for, cover in 3 hours, and then leave. Talk a little bit more about that support, because it obviously continued through your writing of the book and the publication of the book.
Oh yeah, I mean, I had the support, the wholehearted support of the networks, the NBC News group to write this story. And I think that it's because, I mean, there were multiple reasons, but obviously this is a story that deeply resonated on multiple levels, and particularly during the presidency of Donald Trump. We saw him the other night hold a naturalization ceremony in the White House for 5 people, despite the fact that there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people who he himself is preventing from becoming naturalized in time for the November election, because he won't allow remote naturalization ceremonies of people during the coronavirus when they're entirely possible. It's an administration that at every turn has relied on racist rhetoric, xenophobic actions, blocking people from the southwest border because of the only reason you can deduce is who they are, where they came from, and what they look like, when the vast majority of people who are coming here so-called illegally are overstaying visas and flying into this country. Without putting all of this in context, that too is a disservice, because this isn't happening in isolation. Part of that context is, and I know I've mentioned this several times, but is the lead up to this. Donald Trump didn't create racism and didn't create xenophobia and didn't create racial injustice. He has put a megaphone up to it. And the family separation policy is the most supersized version in immigration policy of what that looks like when it's applied to migrants to this country. But none of this would have been possible were it not for systems, and in this case, it's the immigration system. But in our conversation about racial justice, we can also talk about policing, economic inequality, et cetera, that was designed by Democrats and Republicans together and supported together, including by the man who's now running to be the Democratic nominee for president of the United States. And so that's why I think the network is behind this, because this is important contextual information that news viewers should know and understand when they look at the day of news stories on nightly news or on MSNBC or whatever network you choose to watch, because nothing happens in a vacuum and in isolation. And without understanding the interconnectedness of all of this, you're not going to understand what you're seeing. Even me, I mean, that was what happened to me. I didn't understand what I was seeing with my own eyes, and only in learning about all of this important context did I come to understand and describe what I saw, not as separated inside Donald Trump's tragedy, but separated inside an American tragedy, because that's what this is.
I'm not sure how many of our viewers are good students of American or journalistic history, but what you just said mirrors very closely what Edward R. Murrow said on See It Now about Senator Joseph McCarthy in the mid-1950s. Do you see a similarity here?
What I see is a government that at every turn has attempted to use, when it comes specifically to immigration policy, because that's what I cover closely, rhetoric that's not based in reality to create a perception what life is really like, what immigrants are really like, that's not based in anything but dark fantasy. When you go to the border, like I have on countless occasions, and you meet the people in the borderlands, they're some of the kindest, most compassionate, understanding and welcoming people that I've ever met as a journalist. When you go to these places, they're some of the safest big cities in America, despite the fact that you're across the border from some of the most dangerous cities in Mexico, one of the most dangerous countries in the world. And if it was up to the president's version of what's happening there, you'd be going to a war zone when you landed in El Paso or San Diego or McAllen or Brownsville. And that just isn't what's happening, which is why I think it's so important to base reporting today in what I mentioned earlier, facts on the ground. I mean, that's why I called the author's note facts on the ground, because this book started with the facts on the ground, which for me helped pull apart the threads of the fictional characterization of what really is going on at the border.
Let me remind our viewers who may have joined us a short time ago, we're speaking with Jacob Soboroff, author of Separated: Inside an American Tragedy. I want to go back to a couple other questions that were submitted by Laura King
Sure.
of the LA Times. Relate for us. You talked about the Notebook, and I was curious, and Laura had asked whether you actually had lost it or whether you had put it away and you knew exactly where it was.
I thought I might have lost it. To be honest with you, I did think I actually might have lost it. Well, I never thought, like I said, I'm a broadcast journalist, so taking and my, I guess, specialty, so to speak, was doing feature reporting that was more context and color than day of news and source-based reporting. It just wasn't what I did before I covered the story. And so I guess I didn't really know what you're supposed to do with a notebook after you cover a story, but I mean, I kept it. I knew I kept it. I knew I put it away in the storage unit. But when we ultimately decided I was going to do this book project, it was the first thing I thought. I said, "Oh, shit!" Excuse me. I don't know if you're allowed to say that at the National Press Club, but what did I do with my? Yeah, sorry. I said, "What did I do? What did I do with my notebook?" And I honestly, I really didn't. I'm a disorganized person, and so I didn't know if I kept it or if I had it. And when I did find it, it was such a relief because that is where the thread, the central thread, spine of this story ultimately lay.
Well, that's a very relatable story, not only to journalists, but I think to everybody this year who's struggling with work at home and not having places to put things where they normally
You do not want to see the stack of things that is off to the side of this camera.
Overall, and this question comes from Sam Litzinger, CBS News correspondent.
Sure.
How would you assess the media reporting on this story? And also, Sam is interested in knowing, who do you read and watch? Who else is doing good work?
Well, the immigration reporters have already mentioned, and I can't stress it enough again, we're on this story long before I ever touched it. Julia Ainsley, Caitlin Dickerson, Lomi Creel, who was at the Houston Chronicle and is now at ProPublica, did extraordinary work uncovering this policy and continue actually to advance the story amongst many other very talented immigration reporters that are on this stuff in a way that they're so much closer to it, frankly, on a day-to-day basis than I ever will be. And so I turn to my colleagues in the immigration reporting field for really the day-to-day of what's going on. Really across the board, there's extraordinary immigration reporting going on um, uh, right now. And so, I really do rely on them. And I think that, I think if any journalist takes anything away from this book, it's that I'm not the guy that uncovered family separations. I'm not the guy that necessarily held the powerful's feet to the fire. I'm just the guy that happened to be there and saw what I saw and tried to let the American people know and let the world know what I had experienced. And I think that that's okay. I mean, I think it's okay and important as journalists to sort of say, this wasn't my thing. I shouldn't get credit for this. I'm just trying to tell my version of the story from my vantage point, so that we can all work together to build the most complete version of the story that we can.
So you were there, you saw what you saw, you reported it. Has that changed you?
Oh, without a doubt. Not only, I said this before, but not only when I picture what I saw does it make me sick every time that I think about it, but I understand our country in a different way. And as I said, as a white privileged person, if it's critical that I do. I mean, and had I not, I think it would have been this wouldn't have been worth it as a journalist. I think as a journalist, we have to be open to having our own vantage points changed. And one of the ways that I think that I did was that I work at a place where, particularly in prime time, we have a lot of people who are liberal that are watching us. And what I learned is that this is not only Donald Trump's American tragedy. This is all of our American tragedy that had this cumulative buildup effect that is part of the larger American experience project, whatever you want to call it. This is American democracy in action, and it can't be ascribed to one party or another. Maybe perhaps the most important lesson I learned is that when you see something like this happening, the idea of pointing a finger at one person in particular is probably a bad knee-jerk reaction. And I should qualify that by saying nobody's done anything like this other than Donald Trump, but he wouldn't have been able to do this were it not for everything that came before him. And as a journalist, I now know that and will approach almost anything I do differently because of that.
We're hearing from a lot of speakers at the Republican National Convention this week the assertion that if Joe Biden is elected, Americans will not be safe. What's your sense of what a President Biden immigration policy might look like?
Well, there's a lot of worry, frankly, Mike, amongst immigration activists that it'll be reductive, that they're going to go back to the years of Obama and Biden when they did deport more people than any other administration, when they did build the facilities with the cages that Trump ultimately placed separated children in. And yes, it's the same administration that put into place DACA, that attempted to get protections for the parents of DACA recipients. But how will Senator Kamala Harris change that equation? She challenged Vice President Biden herself during some of these debates about some of those immigration policies. Will the Obama-Biden administration still pursue getting around the Flores Settlement Agreement, the indefinite detention of migrant children with their parents, which the Trump administration is doing right at this minute under the cover of coronavirus? Will they pursue the immediate expulsion, as the Trump administration has, of children who arrive here unaccompanied from Central America immediately? Because those two underlying goals that were the underlying goals of family separation were underlying goals of administration immigration policy during the Obama administration. Or will they go more in the direction of the new mainstream conversation amongst the Democratic Party of defunding or reconstituting agencies like ICE and the Department of Homeland Security? So far, I have not heard Vice President Biden talk about tearing down the border wall that President Trump has built, only stopping. And so what I can tell you is there are a lot of people who would like to hear the Democratic nominee for president go further than he's gone heretofore.
Just a few days ago, we had virtually here at the Press Club Harold Holzer, who's written a new book called The Presidents versus the Press. And there was a similar theme that that we discussed along the way in that conversation, with the question being, is Donald Trump doing publicly what a number of other presidents have said privately? And it sounds to me like you're seeing an evolutionary process here, not something, and you've repeated it a few times, that just began the day Donald Trump took office.
One thing I appreciate at least about this president is that he says what he thinks. And so it's easy for all of us to understand. He's become almost like an X-ray vision for the structural problems within the system, because he says exactly what he's thinking about them. And it sort of trickles down into his administration as well. I read it. There's a story I wrote about in the book where Katie Miller, now the wife of Stephen Miller, but at the time her name was Katie Waldman, and she was the spokesperson for the Department of Homeland Security. She's now Vice President Pence's communications director. Said to myself and my colleague and friend Katie Tur, as we sat at dinner with her, talking with her about her role in the family separation policy, that her colleagues sent her to the border to see it herself because they didn't believe she was compassionate enough. And it didn't work. It didn't change her. And I said to her, are you a white nationalist? I mean, I don't get it. What I saw will change me forever. And her response was, no, but I believe if you come to America, you should assimilate. Why should we have little Havanas? And this is a South Florida native saying this to me. I think that there is now permission, because of the way President Trump speaks and acts, for people who are his subordinates to act in the same way. And that's something that I saw both in real time covering separations, when people like Katie told me they were doing it to shock the conscience of America, force Congress to change the rules and to scare people from coming here. I saw it then and I saw it afterwards.
Do you see any hope of sweeping immigration reform legislation that came close during the George W. Bush administration, but hit a conservative Republican roadblock?
I suppose, it depends on the constitution of the House and the Senate, obviously, and who the president is, going into the next election. Not under Donald Trump's Republican Party, not under a party that paints Mexicans as rapists and criminals from day one of the presidential campaign. It's just impossible. There's nothing constructive about that conversation at all. But if there is a Democratic presidency with a Democratic control of both chambers of Congress, who knows? What'll be interesting is the conversation has changed about what immigration reform looks like. Obviously, the Biden ticket has promised to pursue permanent legal status for the 11 million undocumented people. For the dreamers who are in this country, and to figure out a path to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented people who are here in the country today. But this is the United States government. Nothing is ever easy.
We have some questions from actually our executive director of the National Press Club, Bill McCarran. How do you maintain objectivity on a story like this that grabs a hold of your heart when you see young people, children, in cages?
Good. Thanks for the question, Bill. I'm not sure that I kind of alluded to this earlier. I'm not sure objectivity was my neutrality, I guess is a better word, was my goal. Of course, I want to be objective and tell you what I'm seeing as a facts on the ground based reporter. But as a reporter and as a human being, I don't believe that it's healthy to suppress the way that you feel about what you're seeing with your own eyes. It's just none of us have emotionless vantage points about anything. And so the idea that journalists can and should, I'm not sure I subscribe to that notion. And you could probably tell I didn't go to journalism school. I don't have a sort of a traditional journalism upbringing. As I said, my upbringing career-wise was in politics as an advanced person. So I come at this from a slightly different way. And I work in a place perhaps where I'm afforded sort of the latitude to report in that way. And I don't think that should be the way we report about every situation, just sort of walk out and say, hey, this is what I think about something. But in a situation like this, where I have the misfortune, I guess you could say, of seeing with my own eyes what experts, medical professionals describe as torture or government sanctioned child abuse, I don't know that there's a way to describe it neutrally. There is no neutrality when children are being harmed at the hands of the United States government when they don't have to be.
At the risk of bringing up Ed Murrow too many times in this program, you should know, because you mentioned your background was not in journalism, and you have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from New York University in the political arena, as you
That's
mentioned. It's long been said that Murrow, when he put together his team originally in World War II and throughout his career, didn't look for people who were necessarily journalists. He wanted good thinkers. He wanted smart people who could convey information. And the last journalist personally hired by Ed Murrow at CBS News was Marvin Kalb, who I've had the pleasure of working with for the last 26 years on our Kalb Report series. And Marvin was headed toward his PhD in Russian studies at Harvard when he famously received a call from Ed Murrow while he was studying in the library and working on his dissertation, and received an invitation to join CBS News. So talk a little bit about this transformation of you from a political staffer to journalist.
Sure.
And do you feel you're still evolving in that?
I do, and when I studied in college was political theory and philosophy. So I did study political thought, and I think that also informed probably in terms of the way that I think and approach things as a journalist. I try to be critical in my thinking about what's presented to me and what's put in front of us, regardless of who is presenting it. And it's interesting. I think that sort of, particularly what I studied during graduate school, and then my very practical training as a political staffer and advanced person put together, gave me the tools of becoming a broadcast journalist. I'm from LA. I liked to be in plays when I was a kid. It's something that it was a natural progression to go into political journalism. But I think at first, what I started doing at MSNBC was covering voters. And I think that just in hearing from them, letting them tell me what their experiences were, understanding things from their vantage point, in some way made me feel like it was okay to share mine in this story. And so it was this collection of experiences I had both in school and then in my early years working in politics. And then once I got to NBC, also having untraditional sort of jobs in media before then at HuffPost Live and at YouTube and at Pivot, a short-lived network from Participant Media. Like, I got to live in these different ecosystems that all to this day inform the way that I do the reporting that I do.
So thank you. Let's go back to the border. For those who have not spent time on the border recently, describe what it's like when you go down there. I think a lot of people have a picture painted in their mind's eye of what it looks like. Tell us what it's like today.
As I said earlier, it's no war zone. These are some of the most beautiful places that you've ever been to, and whether you are and I can describe to you many of the places I've been to, but like I was in Yuma, Arizona the other day, where Juan and Jose in my story jumped over the fence at San Luis Rio, Colorado, and ended up in the Border Patrol station. And if you look at it solely from the law enforcement perspective, or you would believe that all that's going on in Yuma are buses driving up to the border, thousands of migrants running across the border, in grainy black and white footage that's put out by the White House. And it really, all it is a sea of humanity. In many of these places are binational. People live cross-border lives. The vast majority of the populations of places, particularly in South Texas, but also in California and in Arizona and New Mexico, are largely Latino. People travel back and forth on a daily basis to go to school or to work or to visit their relatives. It's a place, the U.S. border is a place that wouldn't exist with what's going on the Mexican border on the other side. These are two interconnected, intertwined pieces of the same coin. And you can't talk about San Diego without talking about Tijuana. You can't talk about Juarez without talking about El Paso. You can't talk about Brownsville without talking about Matamoros or Reynosa, McAllen. These places are one and the same, despite the fact that there's a dividing line that cuts between them, and there's no way to understand one side without understanding the other.
Do you think there's, this is a question that's come in, do you think there's a cultural problem in the Customs and Border Patrol? Do those involved seem to you to be part of law enforcement? They're protecting the border, to be sure, but they're upholding democratic practices like due process, press freedom, etc. After watching them operate, would you say that they themselves are often ungoverned by law?
Well, there's evidence of that, and it's not just the Facebook group in which these racist and xenophobic and sexist comments and statements and posts were made. You hear it. I mean, there was another case of corruption in the Border Patrol that was an agent was arrested just the other day. It's too much of a coincidence, like with systematic shooting of black men by law enforcement throughout the country. These incidents, if you look at them as isolated incidents, sure, appear to be isolated. But when you zoom out and see them as part of a larger system, you have to understand them for what they are. You mentioned the violation of constitutional rights of people. In the book, I write about how John Mitnick, the general counsel of the Department of Homeland Security, warned Kirstjen Nielsen, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, who's the boss of all of these operators and the biggest law enforcement agency in the country, that separating families would likely violate the due process rights, the Fifth Amendment rights of the migrants who were coming to this country, their constitutional rights to be treated fairly under the law. Yet she signed the document anyways, allowing the policy to move forward. And so when you talk about, is it isolated amongst line agents or officials just on the ground, I don't think you can look at it without sort of the tacit approval of that type of behavior from people at the top. And there's no better evidence than Nielsen signing the policy and moving forward with it, despite being warned that it may very well violate the Constitution of the United States of America.
We have a question in that arena back to journalists. In recent years, the United States has tried to deport several Mexican journalists who have fled death threats from the cartels or from the military. This was the case in our own 2017 National Press Club Aubuchon Press Freedom honoree Emilio Gutierrez Soto. What signal does it send when the United States deports Mexican journalists who are then forced to return to Mexico at great personal peril, up to and including being murdered while under government protection?
The treatment of the U.S. government of journalists, particularly covering these issues, has been really shameful. My colleague Julia Ainsley reported with our affiliate in San Diego about a list that Customs and Border Protection was keeping at the San Ysidro port of entry in between Tijuana and San Diego of not only activists but journalists on basically a watch list. And they would pull people into secondary screenings who were journalists. This is the U.S. government keeping track of journalists crossing back and forth across the border who are covering these issues. If that does not send a chilling message about the First Amendment in this country, I don't know what does.
We're coming up to the last couple of questions, and I'd like to know if you feel you have another book in you now. You've made this transition, which not a lot of people can do, from broadcast journalist to writer. There are writers who are very good at analysis and perspective on television and on radio, but we don't have a lot of broadcasters who then turn into print journalists. Tell us a little bit about that, and then what might be next for you as you continue. We know you're still working.
I don't know. I didn't intend to write a book. I think the reason I was able to write this book is that I covered something that I think it would have been a disservice not to document. And that's why I chose to do this. I think that there was a lot of learning that I had to do, and I felt like many other people who followed the reporting I did in real time would benefit from that learning that I needed to do as well for themselves. And so that's why I wrote about this topic in particular. I suppose I'll see where I go next in covering all of this. But when it comes to, what's next, obviously we have a presidential election coming up, and, as a part of our, team coverage here of the conventions over the course of the last couple of weeks, but also I love working in long form. And Katie Tur and I did a documentary series for MSNBC called American Swamp, a 4-part special where we looked into corruption in Washington, D.C. across both political parties. It's a medium that now, as we look at different formats in television news, it's one that I intend to continue with, being able to tell these stories in a longer way. Part of reporting the border story and why I ended up in the middle of all this in the first place was doing an hour for Dateline about the realities of life along the southwest border, and that's what I love about being in broadcast. It's the book version of reporting television news. Having the depth and the breadth on TV to show with pictures. What really oftentimes is only something that you can describe, with the pen or with your computer at this point. So I think doing what I do in TV is almost the book version of that, and so I hope to continue with both, frankly.
And finally, the president ultimately signed an executive order that ended systematic family separations. That must have been a defining moment for you as a journalist.
Yeah, it was 7 days after I first ended up down there on the border. I got there on the 13th. He signed it on the 20th. And he said very specifically he signed it because he didn't like the sights and the sounds of the separations happening. And I mean, I think that that's credit not to me, but to all the journalists that were down there, especially ProPublica, that published the audio of the wailing children inside the Border Patrol facility. Trump responded, and it was, I think at that point, it was probably the most significant retreat by the president on any policy issue. And it was directly because of the work that not only the news media, but activists and really everyday Americans were making about this. So it wasn't some kind of badge of honor. I don't walk around saying that I feel great personally that Trump backed down because of it. And by the way, there are still children at risk of separation to this day. The policy's not done, despite what the president said and did. But it shows the power of the pen, the power of the camera, the power of the news media, and the power of those who have our backs every day and consume the work that we do.
Thank you. And that will be our last word. Our thanks to Jacob Soboroff, author of Separated: Inside an American Tragedy. Jacob, we're pleased to present you with our National Press Club coffee mug. We'll get you a clean one, not the one I've been drinking from during
I can't wait.
Conversation, along with our sincere hope that you will join us again in person in the very near future. Great good luck, and thanks again so much for joining us.
It'd be my pleasure, and thank you, Mike. I appreciate it.
Our thanks to our producer, Lindsay Underwood, our headliners, co-team leaders, Donna Leinwan Legere and Lori Russo, and our terrific National Press Club team behind the scenes here at the Broadcast Operations Center. We thank our members and guests for your good questions and for joining us. Be well, stay safe, and have a good day. We're clear. Okay.